The Sacramento 1970 cold case that shocked a community began with a woman who never came home from work. Nancy Bennallack was supposed to be planning her wedding on October 25, 1970. Instead, she became the victim of one of Sacramento's most brutal unsolved murders. The 28-year-old court reporter had finished another ordinary day at the courthouse. Chatting with colleagues about flower arrangements and venue decorations, her life was picture perfect. A successful career, a loving fiancé, and a bright future stretching ahead like golden California sunshine. That evening, neighbors in her quiet Bell Street apartment complex heard faint sounds around 10:30, muffled noises, brief disturbances that seemed too ordinary to investigate. Nobody called police, nobody knocked on doors. The sounds faded into the October night, carrying with them the last moments of Nancy's life. When Nancy failed to appear at work the next morning, her colleagues felt the first stirrings of unease. Court reporters don't miss work. They don't disappear without explanation. Her fiancé discovered the horrific truth when he found her body in the bedroom, stabbed over 30 times in a frenzy of violence that left investigators stunned. There was no forced entry, no evidence of robbery, just brutal, inexplicable murder that would haunt Sacramento for 52 years. The killer vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a community forever changed by the realization that evil had walked among them undetected. Detectives promised swift justice, but decades passed in silence. Forensic science evolved. Investigators retired. The case files gathered dust. Then, in 2022, a breakthrough arrived that would finally unmask the monster who had been hiding in plain sight since 1970. But would the truth bring peace or only deeper anguish to those who had waited so long for answers? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Sacramento's golden October light filtered through the courthouse windows as Nancy Bennallack gathered her stenographer's notes and prepared to end another productive day. The 28-year-old court reporter moved with practiced efficiency, her fingers dancing over paperwork with the same precision that made her invaluable in the courtroom. Colleagues lingered nearby, discussing weekend plans and sharing gentle office gossip. "Any updates on the wedding planning?" asked Margaret, the clerk who sat 3 desks away. Nancy's face brightened with the glow that comes from being deeply in love. "We've narrowed it down to 2 venues," she replied, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "The country club has that beautiful garden, but the hotel ballroom might be more practical for the reception." The conversation continued for several minutes, touching on flowers, music, and the dozen details that transform a ceremony into a celebration. Nancy's enthusiasm was infectious, her excitement evident in every gesture and smile. She had found her perfect match, built a successful career, and was planning the wedding of her dreams. Life had delivered everything she had worked toward. As 5 o'clock approached, Nancy bid farewell to her co-workers and walked through the courthouse halls for the last time. She passed judges' chambers and conference rooms where she had recorded countless proceedings, her skilled fingers capturing testimony that would shape verdicts and determine fates. Her work mattered, she mattered. The future stretched ahead with endless possibility. The drive home to her Bell Street apartment took 20 minutes through Sacramento's tree-lined neighborhoods. Nancy's small unit in the quiet complex represented independence and achievement. Her own space, carefully decorated with items that reflected her personality. Neighbors knew her as friendly but private, professional but warm. She would wave from her doorway and exchange pleasantries about weather and weekend activities. That evening, Nancy prepared dinner alone, as she often did on weeknights. Her fiancé had his own apartment across town, and they maintained a respectful distance that felt appropriate for their generation. Marriage would bring them together permanently, but for now, they courted with old-fashioned patience and propriety. Nancy settled into her favorite armchair with the telephone, dialing the familiar number she had memorized months ago. Her fiancé answered on the second ring, his voice warm with affection that had only deepened since their engagement. "How was your day, darling?" he asked, and Nancy could picture him loosening his tie in his own apartment, settling in for their nightly conversation. "Busy but good," she replied, curling her legs beneath her. "We had that complicated custody case, and the attorneys kept interrupting each other. I thought my fingers might cramp from trying to keep up." They talked for nearly an hour, discussing wedding details with the careful attention of people who understand that marriage is both a celebration and a commitment. They debated guest lists and menu options, laughed about relatives who would inevitably cause minor drama, and made tentative plans for their honeymoon destination. "I love you," he said as their conversation wound toward its natural conclusion. "I love you too," Nancy replied, meaning it completely. Sweet dreams. She replaced the receiver on its cradle and moved through her evening routine with the comfortable rhythm of established habit. Nancy fed her cat, a tabby who had adopted her as much as she had adopted him. She reviewed her calendar for the next day, noting court sessions and deadlines. She drew the curtains against the October darkness and prepared for bed with no awareness that someone outside was watching her movements. The apartment complex settled into quiet evening sounds, televisions murmuring, doors closing softly, residents preparing for sleep. Nancy felt safe in her small community, protected by familiar routines and neighborly proximity. She had no reason to fear the night or the figure who moved silently through the courtyard shadows. Outside, footsteps crunched on the gravel pathways that connected the apartment buildings. The complex was designed for privacy, with individual units arranged around landscaped courtyards that provided both beauty and sound barriers. During daylight hours, children played on the grass while adults tended small gardens, but darkness transformed the space into something more isolated, where shadows could conceal unwelcome visitors. Richard John Davis moved with deliberate stealth through the familiar terrain. At 27, he was unremarkable in appearance and manner, the kind of neighbor who attracted no particular attention or suspicion. He had lived in the complex long enough to know the rhythms of other residents, to understand when people came and went, when windows lit up and went dark. Davis had watched Nancy from a distance, noting her schedule and habits with the patience of someone who found purpose in observation. She represented something he wanted to possess or destroy. Investigators would never fully understand his motivation, even decades later when science finally revealed his identity. He approached Nancy's ground floor unit with confidence born from familiarity. The building's construction offered multiple access points, and Davis had identified the path that would attract least attention. He scaled the small balcony with practiced ease, his movements suggesting this was not his first nocturnal visit to the area. Inside, Nancy heard something that made her pause while brushing her teeth, a sound that didn't quite belong, not loud enough to be alarming, but unfamiliar enough to catch her attention. She stood in her bathroom doorway, listening to the night sounds and trying to identify what had seemed out of place. The sound came again, faint but distinct. Nancy walked to her living room window and peered through a gap in the curtains, seeing only darkness and the dim outlines of familiar landscaping. She waited several minutes, but nothing moved in her field of vision. Nancy returned to her bedroom, still feeling slightly unsettled but not genuinely alarmed. The apartment complex was safe, the neighbors were known quantities, and her doors were locked. She completed her bedtime routine and was preparing to turn off the lights when she heard her sliding door move. The sound was unmistakable, the particular scrape of aluminum against track that her balcony door made when opened. Nancy's heart began to pound as she realized someone was inside her apartment. She had no time to reach the phone, no opportunity to call for help or escape. Richard John Davis stood in her bedroom doorway, and Nancy saw her death in his eyes. What happened next was brutal and swift, a frenzied attack that investigators would later describe as overkill, suggesting rage or psychological disturbance that went far beyond simple murder. Nancy fought for her life, but she was overpowered by someone younger and stronger, someone who had come prepared for violence. The attack lasted several minutes, though Nancy's suffering ended much sooner. Davis stabbed her over 30 times, inflicting wounds that spoke of fury rather than simple intent to kill. The brutality suggested personal motivation, though investigators would never establish any prior relationship between victim and killer. Neighbors later remembered hearing faint sounds around 10:30, noises that could have been moving furniture, closing doors, or the struggle of a woman fighting for her life. But apartment living requires a certain willful deafness, and no one investigated or called police. Davis left through the same balcony door he had used to enter, vanishing into the October night with his victim's blood on his hands. Nancy lay dead in her bedroom, surrounded by the personal belongings that had defined her life: photographs of family, books she had enjoyed, the wedding planner that would never be completed. October 26th dawned bright and clear, the kind of California morning that makes residents feel grateful for their location. The courthouse opened with its usual bustle of attorneys, clerks, and support staff preparing for another day of proceedings. Court reporters took their positions, stenographers tested equipment, and judges reviewed dockets. But Nancy Bennallack's desk remained empty. Margaret glanced over several times, expecting to see her colleague arrive with apologies about traffic or oversleeping. Nancy was never late. Her punctuality was legendary among courthouse staff, and her absence created a small void in the day's rhythm. By 10 o'clock, concern had evolved into worry. Margaret approached the supervisor, mentioning Nancy's uncharacteristic absence and suggesting someone call to check on her welfare. The supervisor tried Nancy's home number repeatedly, but no one answered. Nancy's fiancé received the call at his office, and his concern was immediate. Nancy would never miss work without calling, would never leave colleagues wondering about her whereabouts. Something was wrong, and the certainty of that knowledge sent cold fear through his chest. He made excuses to his own supervisor and drove across town to Nancy's apartment complex, his mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps she was ill, unable to reach the phone. Perhaps she had experienced some minor emergency that prevented her from calling work. Perhaps there was a simple explanation that would make his worry seem foolish, but the alternative scenarios his imagination constructed were darker. Sacramento was a safe city, but crime existed everywhere. Women living alone faced particular vulnerabilities, and Nancy's youth and attractiveness might have attracted unwanted attention. He parked outside her building and approached her front door with growing dread, sensing somehow that his worst fears were about to be confirmed. Nancy's fiancé knocked repeatedly, calling her name and listening for any response. The silence felt wrong, not the quiet of sleep or absence, but something heavier and more ominous. He walked around the building, checking windows and looking for any sign of her presence. Finding nothing, he located the building manager and explained his concern. Nancy had failed to appear at work, wasn't answering her phone, and wasn't responding to knocks at her door. The manager, a middle-aged woman who knew Nancy as a quiet, reliable tenant, agreed that the situation warranted investigation. They returned to Nancy's unit together and the manager used her master key to unlock the front door. The fiancé called Nancy's name as they entered, still hoping for a simple explanation, but the apartment felt different, charged with a tension that made both visitors uncomfortable. They found Nancy's body in the bedroom and the scene was far worse than anything either had imagined. Blood covered the walls and floor, and Nancy lay crumpled near her bed, victim of a savage attack that spoke of rage and brutality. The manager screamed and stumbled backward, while Nancy's fiancé stood frozen in shock and disbelief. The police arrived within minutes, followed by paramedics who could do nothing except confirm what was already obvious. Nancy Bennallack was dead, murdered in her own bedroom by someone who had entered without forcing any doors or windows. The killer had been inside the apartment, suggesting either that Nancy had known her attacker or that he had possessed exceptional stealth and skill. Crime scene technicians cordoned off the building and began the methodical process of collecting evidence. Neighbors gathered in the courtyard, whispering and staring as Nancy's body was wheeled out in a black bag. Detective William Morrison took charge of the investigation with the confidence of someone who had solved dozens of homicides during his 20-year career. Morrison was methodical and thorough, approaching each case with systematic precision that had earned him respect throughout the Sacramento Police Department. He walked through Nancy's apartment with the detached professionalism necessary for violent crime scenes, noting details that might provide clues to the killer's identity. The absence of forced entry suggested Nancy had either known her attacker or that he had possessed unusual skill in gaining access. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Nancy's purse contained cash and credit cards, and her jewelry remained untouched. The brutality of the attack suggested personal motivation rather than random crime. Morrison had seen murders of passion and murders for profit, and this felt like the former. Someone had wanted Nancy dead with an intensity that went beyond simple killing. The 30-plus stab wounds spoke of rage, possibly sexual frustration, and certainly psychological disturbance. Morrison interviewed Nancy's fiancé first, following standard procedure by examining those closest to the victim. The young man was devastated but cooperative, providing detailed information about Nancy's habits, relationships, and recent activities. He had a solid alibi for the previous evening and showed no signs of deception or guilt. Neighbors provided varying accounts of sounds heard around 10:30 the previous evening. Some remembered brief disturbances, while others claimed to have heard nothing unusual. Morrison noted the inconsistencies but wasn't surprised. Apartment dwellers learned to tune out minor noises, and memories often proved unreliable. The crime scene yielded blood samples, fingerprints, and trace evidence that would be processed using 1970s forensic technology. Morrison felt cautiously optimistic that physical evidence would identify the killer, not knowing that the case would remain unsolved for over 50 years. News of Nancy's murder spread through Sacramento like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The morning newspapers carried headlines about the brutal killing of a young court reporter, and the story captured public attention with its combination of violence and mystery. Nancy's photograph appeared on front pages, a professional headshot that showed her warm smile and bright eyes, making her death feel more personal to readers who had never met her. The article described her as an exemplary citizen, beloved by colleagues and engaged to be married. She represented every woman's daughter, sister, or friend. Fear began to permeate the community, particularly among women living alone. If Nancy Bennallack could be murdered in her own apartment, if a killer could enter without forcing doors or windows, then no one was truly safe. Locksmiths reported increased business as residents upgraded security systems and added deadbolts. Nancy's apartment complex became a focal point for both media attention and neighborhood anxiety. Residents found themselves studying their neighbors with new suspicion, wondering if the killer lived among them. The complex had always felt like a safe, friendly community, but murder had transformed it into something more ominous. Detective Morrison held press conferences appealing for information and assuring the public that every resource was being devoted to solving the case. He spoke with the measured confidence of an experienced investigator, but privately he was troubled by the lack of obvious suspects or clear motives. Nancy's family arrived from out of town to make funeral arrangements and support her fiancé through the initial shock of loss. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that someone had stolen their daughter's life and remained free to potentially harm others. Detective Morrison expanded his investigation to include everyone with connections to Nancy or access to the apartment complex. Richard John Davis appeared on the list of residents to be interviewed, living just 3 buildings away from Nancy's unit. At 27, Davis worked sporadically in construction and maintenance, keeping irregular hours that made him less visible to other residents. Morrison found Davis cooperative but unremarkable during their brief interview. Davis claimed to barely know Nancy by sight, said he had been home alone the night of the murder, and expressed appropriate shock at the violence that had occurred so close to his own apartment. His manner was polite but distant, and he answered questions without elaboration or apparent nervousness. Davis's apartment revealed nothing suspicious: basic furnishings, few personal belongings, and no obvious signs of recent criminal activity. Morrison noted his name in the case file but found no evidence to justify continued scrutiny. Davis seemed like dozens of other residents, ordinary people living quiet lives who happened to be in proximity to extraordinary violence. Other interviews proved equally unproductive. Nancy's co-workers described her as professional and friendly, but not someone who discussed personal problems or seemed frightened of anyone. Her social circle was small and consisted mainly of work colleagues and her fiancé's friends. No one could identify potential enemies or suggest reasons why anyone would want to harm her. Morrison began investigating the possibility of random crime, a drifter or stranger who had selected Nancy as a target of opportunity. This theory was troubling because it suggested the killer might strike again, but it also fit the evidence better than assuming Nancy had known her attacker. Tips from the public flooded the police station, but most proved worthless. People reported suspicious characters, strange vehicles, and unusual activities that had nothing to do with Nancy's murder. Morrison followed each lead with diminishing optimism, knowing that most tips in high-profile cases were generated by fear rather than genuine information. Weeks passed without significant progress, and Morrison found himself chasing increasingly tenuous leads. A jealous ex-boyfriend was investigated and cleared. A courthouse defendant who had made threatening remarks was questioned and released. A maintenance worker who had access to apartment buildings was scrutinized and eliminated as a suspect. The forensic evidence proved less helpful than Morrison had hoped. Fingerprints recovered from Nancy's apartment belonged to her fiancé, and friends who had visited recently. Blood samples confirmed Nancy as the only victim, but provided no information about the killer. The primitive DNA technology of 1970 could not extract usable profiles from the limited evidence available. Morrison worked the case obsessively, reviewing files and re-interviewing witnesses in search of overlooked details. But criminal investigations require breaks: witness cooperation, physical evidence, or confessions, and Nancy's case provided none of these. The killer had vanished completely, leaving behind only questions and a traumatized community. Nancy's funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including courthouse staff, neighbors, and strangers touched by her story. Her fiancé delivered a eulogy that spoke of dreams unfulfilled and love interrupted by senseless violence. Her parents maintained dignified composure while privately struggling with grief and rage at the injustice of their loss. The media coverage began to fade as other stories claimed public attention. Morrison continued working the case, but new homicides demanded immediate attention, and Nancy's file gradually moved to the back burner. The detective felt the familiar frustration of unsolved cases, the knowledge that somewhere a killer walked free while a family searched for answers that might never come. By Christmas 1970, the active investigation had essentially stalled. Morrison kept the file open and occasionally followed up on tips, but he had exhausted obvious leads without identifying a viable suspect. Nancy's case became what detectives dreaded most, a mystery that might remain forever unsolved. Nancy's first Christmas as a murder victim was devastating for everyone who had loved her. Her family gathered as tradition demanded, but her absence dominated every conversation and shadowed every moment of attempted celebration. The empty chair at dinner, the unwrapped gifts that would have been hers, the future she would never see, all served as painful reminders of what had been stolen. Her fiancé struggled with survivor guilt and the peculiar loneliness of mourning someone with whom he had planned to share his life. Friends offered comfort, but no one could truly understand the depth of his loss or the particular anguish of dreams interrupted by violence. He found himself replaying their last phone conversation, searching for warnings or clues he might have missed. Nancy's parents channeled their grief into determination, becoming advocates for their daughter's case. When media attention waned, they called Detective Morrison regularly, asking about progress and pushing for continued investigation. They attended community meetings and spoke with reporters, refusing to let Nancy's memory fade or her murder be forgotten. The apartment complex struggled to return to normalcy, but Nancy's death had fundamentally changed the community's character. Residents eyed each other with new suspicion, wondering if the killer lived among them. Property managers installed better lighting and encouraged tenants to report unusual activities. The sense of safety that had once characterized the complex was gone, replaced by wariness and doubt. Detective Morrison spent New Year's Eve reviewing Nancy's case file, hoping fresh perspective might reveal overlooked clues. But the evidence remained frustratingly limited, and potential suspects had been eliminated or proved impossible to verify. Morrison faced the reality that many detectives encounter: some crimes cannot be solved with the tools and techniques available at the time they occur. As 1971 began, Nancy Bennallack's murder remained an open case with no clear resolution in sight. The investigation would continue, but hope for quick justice was fading. The 1970s brought changes to Sacramento and to criminal investigation techniques, but Nancy's case remained stubbornly unsolved. Detective Morrison retired in 1978, passing the file to a younger investigator who reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes but reached similar conclusions. The case lacked the physical evidence necessary for prosecution, even if a suspect could be identified. Richard John Davis continued living in the apartment complex for several more years before moving to other parts of Sacramento. He maintained a low profile, working construction jobs and avoiding behavior that would attract police attention. To neighbors and coworkers, he seemed like an ordinary man living an unremarkable life. No one suspected that a killer walked among them, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. New forensic techniques emerged during the decade, including improved blood typing and early applications of genetic markers. Nancy's case was occasionally revisited when technological advances offered potential for new evidence, but the limited physical samples available yielded no breakthrough results. Nancy's parents aged visibly under the strain of prolonged grief and unanswered questions. They attended annual memorials and continued advocating for their daughter's case, but the passage of time made their mission increasingly difficult. Media attention had long since moved to other stories, and public interest in unsolved cases from years past was limited. The apartment complex changed ownership and underwent renovations, erasing physical reminders of the crime that had once dominated local news. New tenants moved into Nancy's former unit, unaware of the violence that had occurred there. Life continued, but Nancy's murder remained an open wound for those who remembered her. Detective Morrison's successor organized the case file and preserved evidence according to department protocols, not knowing that the materials would remain untouched for decades. The investigation had exhausted conventional approaches, and without new witnesses or evidence, progress seemed impossible. By 1979, Nancy's case had become what homicide detectives call a cold case. Technically open, but practically dormant, waiting for the break that might never come. 1980s brought significant advances in forensic science, including the early development of DNA analysis techniques. Law enforcement agencies began to understand the potential of genetic evidence, though the technology remained expensive and limited in application. Nancy's case was reviewed again in 1985 when Sacramento police participated in a pilot program for genetic testing of cold cases. Samples from Nancy's apartment were submitted for analysis, but the results proved inconclusive. The preserved evidence had degraded over 15 years, and the early DNA testing methods required larger samples than were available. The technology that would eventually solve Nancy's case existed in rudimentary form, but practical applications remained years in the future. Nancy's parents entered their 60s still seeking justice for their daughter. They had become fixtures at police headquarters, known to every detective who worked homicide cases. Their persistence was both admirable and heartbreaking, evidence of love that refused to surrender hope, even when hope seemed futile. The case attracted occasional media attention when anniversaries provided news hooks or when similar crimes occurred elsewhere. Nancy's story was included in magazine articles about unsolved murders and featured on early television programs dedicated to cold cases. But public interest remained limited, and no new witnesses or evidence emerged from the exposure. Richard John Davis continued his unremarkable existence, working various jobs and avoiding the kind of trouble that would bring police scrutiny. He had successfully concealed his crime for over a decade, and the passage of time made discovery increasingly unlikely. The investigation had moved on to other cases, and Davis had apparently committed the perfect murder. New detectives inherited Nancy's file as personnel changes occurred within the department. Each brought fresh perspective and renewed energy, but the fundamental problems remained unchanged. The case lacked the evidence necessary to identify and prosecute the killer, and conventional investigation techniques had been exhausted years earlier. Nancy's case became a teaching tool for new investigators, an example of how violent crimes could remain unsolved despite dedicated effort and sound technique. The 1990s saw continued advancement in DNA technology, but Nancy's case remained frustratingly out of reach. More sophisticated genetic analysis techniques were developed, but the degraded evidence from her apartment still could not provide usable results. The samples that might have identified her killer had been collected with 1,970 methods and preserved under conditions that were inadequate by later standards. In 1997, Richard John Davis died quietly of natural causes, taking his secret to the grave. He had lived for 27 years after murdering Nancy, experiencing freedom and normalcy that had been denied to his victim. His death was barely noted, a brief obituary in the local newspaper that described him as a longtime Sacramento resident with no surviving family. Davis's apartment was cleared by property managers who found nothing suspicious among his belongings. Personal effects were donated to charity or discarded, and any evidence that might have connected him to Nancy's murder was lost forever. The killer had successfully hidden his crime until the end of his life. Nancy's case file grew thicker as new detectives added their own investigation notes and evidence logs. The murder had become institutional memory within the Sacramento Police Department, a reminder of the cases that got away, the victims who never received justice. Older officers would mention Nancy's name to newcomers, describing her case as one of the department's most frustrating failures. Nancy's parents both died during the 1990s, carrying their grief and unanswered questions to their own graves. They had devoted decades to seeking justice for their daughter, attending press conferences and supporting other victims' families, but they never learned the identity of Nancy's killer. Their persistence had kept the case alive when it might have been forgotten entirely. The decade ended with Nancy's murder still officially unsolved, the case file preserved in storage while active investigations focused on more recent crimes. Technology existed that could theoretically solve the case, but the practical application remained elusive. Nancy's surviving relatives continued their family's tradition of seeking justice, though their number had dwindled over the decades. Nieces and nephews who barely remembered their aunt maintained contact with police, calling on anniversaries and asking about progress. Their persistence kept Nancy's name in departmental memory when bureaucratic convenience might have allowed it to be forgotten. The apartment complex where Nancy had lived underwent another renovation, and her former unit was completely remodeled. New tenants had no knowledge of the violence that had occurred there 3 decades earlier. The physical spaces that had witnessed her murder were transformed beyond recognition, erasing tangible connections to the crime. Memorial services on the anniversary of Nancy's death drew smaller crowds each year, but the gatherings continued. Former colleagues, elderly neighbors, and family members would meet at her gravesite to remember a woman whose life had been cut short by senseless violence. These ceremonies served as testimony that some victims are not forgotten, even when justice remains elusive. Sacramento had changed dramatically since 1970, growing from a modest city into a major metropolitan area. The neighborhoods where Nancy had lived and worked were transformed by development and demographic shifts. But her case remained a constant, filed away in police headquarters and occasionally reviewed by detectives hoping to find overlooked clues. The millennium approached, with Nancy's case still unsolved after 30 years. Forensic science had advanced far beyond what investigators in 1970 could have imagined, but the practical barriers to solving cold cases remained formidable. Evidence degraded over time, witnesses died or forgot crucial details, and departmental resources were focused on current crimes rather than historical mysteries. Nancy's case represented thousands of similar unsolved murders across the country, crimes that challenged investigators, devastated families, and reminded communities that evil sometimes escapes immediate punishment. Our podcast is brought to you by American Gunpowder. Evil sometimes escapes immediate punishment, but technology was advancing and new techniques were being developed that would eventually reach into the past to deliver justice that had long been delayed. The year 2000 brought new hope to cold case investigations as DNA technology continued improving. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched national databases that could compare genetic profiles from different jurisdictions, and local police departments began systematically reviewing old cases for potential evidence that could be retested with modern techniques. Nancy's case was included in this review process, and her evidence samples were resubmitted for analysis using methods that were far more sophisticated than those available in previous decades. Detectives hoped that improved techniques could extract usable DNA profiles from materials that had previously yielded inconclusive results. The initial results were promising, but incomplete. Scientists could identify male DNA that did not belong to Nancy or any of the known individuals who had been in her apartment, but the profile was partial and could not be entered into criminal databases for comparison. The evidence suggested that genetic material from Nancy's killer had been preserved, but additional technological advances would be necessary to develop a complete profile. This partial success energized investigators who had inherited Nancy's case from earlier generations of detectives. They began planning for future analysis when technology became available, and they carefully preserved all remaining evidence under optimal conditions. Nancy's case was no longer hopeless, it was simply waiting for science to catch up with ambition. Nancy's extended family received regular updates about these developments, and their decades of patient advocacy seemed finally justified. They had maintained faith that technology would eventually provide answers, and initial DNA results suggested their faith had been warranted. Justice might still be possible, even after 30 years. The new millennium began with renewed optimism about solving cold cases that had once seemed impossible. Nancy's murder remained technically unsolved, but the foundation was being laid for future breakthroughs that would transform cold case investigation and bring closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Detective Sarah Chen joined Sacramento's newly formed cold case unit in 2015, bringing enthusiasm and modern training to investigations that had stalled years or decades earlier. The unit represented the department's commitment to solving historical crimes using contemporary techniques, and Chen was specifically interested in cases where DNA evidence might provide breakthroughs. Nancy's case was among the first files Chen reviewed, and she was struck by the thoroughness of earlier investigations and the persistence of the victim's family. Chen studied crime scene photographs, witness statements, and evidence logs, trying to understand why previous efforts had failed to identify the killer. The answer seemed clear. Investigators in 1970 had done excellent work with the tools available to them, but those tools had been inadequate for the task. Chen coordinated with the crime laboratory to reassess all physical evidence from Nancy's case. Technological advances in the 15 years since the last analysis had been dramatic, and techniques that were experimental in 2000 were now routine. The possibility of extracting complete DNA profiles from degraded evidence had improved significantly. Evidence storage had also improved, with climate-controlled facilities and proper preservation methods that maintained sample integrity over long periods. Items that might have degraded in earlier storage conditions were now viable for advanced testing. Chen felt cautiously optimistic that Nancy's case might finally yield the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 45 years. The cold case unit operated differently from traditional homicide investigation, focusing on systematic review and technological application rather than witness interviews and active surveillance. Chen approached Nancy's case as both historical puzzle and scientific challenge, determined to exhaust every possibility before acknowledging defeat. Crime laboratory technicians processed Nancy's evidence with techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators in 1970. Advanced DNA extraction methods could isolate genetic material from tiny samples, and sophisticated analysis equipment could develop complete profiles from degraded specimens that earlier technology could not process. The breakthrough came in late 2021 when analysts successfully extracted a complete male DNA profile from evidence preserved at Nancy's crime scene. The profile was clean, detailed, and suitable for database comparison, exactly what investigators had hoped to find for over 50 years. Chen submitted the profile to the Combined DNA Index System, the national database that contains genetic information from convicted criminals and unsolved cases. The search returned no matches, indicating that Nancy's killer had never been arrested for a serious crime, or that he had died before DNA collection became routine in criminal processing. The lack of database matches was disappointing but not surprising. Many violent crimes from earlier decades were committed by individuals who either died before providing DNA samples or who successfully avoided arrest for subsequent crimes. Chen knew that traditional database searches represented only the first step in modern cold case investigation. The next phase would involve forensic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that compared crime scene DNA to genetic information voluntarily submitted by individuals researching their family histories. This approach had solved numerous cold cases across the country, identifying suspects through family relationships rather than direct criminal database matches. Chen contacted a forensic genealogist who specialized in cold case investigation, beginning a process that would trace family trees backward through generations to identify potential suspects. Nancy's case was entering uncharted territory, using methods that previous investigators could never have imagined. The forensic genealogist began with the DNA profile from Nancy's crime scene, uploading the genetic data to ancestry databases that contain millions of family trees submitted by individuals researching their genealogical backgrounds. The process required patience and systematic analysis, building connections between distant relatives to identify common ancestors. Initial results identified several potential family lines that could include Nancy's killer. The genealogists constructed detailed family trees tracing descendants of common ancestors and identifying male relatives who would have been adults in 1970. This process eliminated many possibilities while highlighting others that warranted further investigation. Chen worked closely with the genealogist, providing historical context and geographical information that could narrow the search. Nancy's killer had to have been in Sacramento in 1970, with access to her apartment complex and opportunity to commit the crime. These constraints eliminated many genealogical possibilities while focusing attention on specific individuals. The investigation began to center on one particular family line that produced several male descendants living in Sacramento during the relevant time period. One name stood out: Richard John Davis, who had lived in Nancy's apartment complex and had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation. Chen retrieved the original case files and found Davis's name in the witness list. Noted as a neighbor who claimed minimal knowledge of Nancy and provided no useful information, Davis defeated his claim. This is like silly as possible. His interview had been routine, and investigators in 1970 had found no reason to consider him a serious suspect. He had been hiding in plain sight for 5 decades. Davis had died in 1997, making prosecution impossible, but providing certainty about his inability to harm additional victims. The genealogical evidence was compelling, but required verification through traditional investigative methods to confirm the connection between DNA evidence and the identified suspect. Chen's investigation into Richard John Davis revealed a man who had lived quietly in Sacramento for decades after murdering Nancy, working various jobs and avoiding behavior that would attract police attention. He had no significant criminal record, no history of violence, and no obvious connections to Nancy beyond their proximity as neighbors. The revelation was simultaneously satisfying and frustrating. Nancy's killer had been identified through cutting-edge science and genealogical detective work, but he had escaped earthly justice by dying 25 years earlier. There would be no arrest, no trial, and no opportunity for legal resolution of the case. Chen coordinated with the crime laboratory to verify the genealogical findings through additional DNA analysis. Scientists compared genetic markers from the crime scene evidence to known samples from Davis family members, confirming the relationship with scientific certainty. Richard John Davis was Nancy Bennallack's killer, identified through methods that were inconceivable when the crime occurred. The case presented unique challenges for law enforcement and the victim's family. Scientific evidence had solved a 52-year-old murder, but the traditional satisfactions of criminal justice, arrest, prosecution, and punishment were impossible. The case would be officially closed, but closure for Nancy's loved ones would be more complicated. Chen prepared to notify Nancy's surviving relatives about the identification of her killer. These conversations would bring long-awaited answers while highlighting the limitations of delayed justice. The family had waited over 5 decades to learn who had murdered Nancy, but they would never see him held accountable in a courtroom. The case demonstrated both the power and limitations of modern investigative techniques. Science could reach across decades to identify killers, but it could not resurrect the dead for prosecution or restore the lives that had been stolen from victims and their families. Chen met with Nancy's surviving relatives in a conference room at police headquarters, the same building where investigators had worked on her case for over 50 years. The family members who attended represented multiple generations, including people who had never met Nancy but had grown up hearing stories about their murdered relative. "We've identified Nancy's killer," Chen announced, watching as emotions played across the faces of people who had waited decades for this moment. His name was Richard John Davis, and he lived in Nancy's apartment complex at the time of the murder. The revelation produced mixed reactions. Relief at finally knowing the truth competed with frustration that Davis had lived freely for 27 years after killing Nancy. Family members asked dozens of questions. How had he avoided detection? Had he killed other women? Why had he chosen Nancy as his victim? Chen answered what she could, explaining the limitations of 1970s investigative techniques and the random nature of many violent crimes. Davis appeared to have killed Nancy without prior relationship or obvious motivation, making the crime particularly difficult to solve using conventional methods available at the time. The family's response reflected the complex emotions that accompanied delayed justice. They were grateful for the identification of Nancy's killer and impressed by the scientific methods that had made the breakthrough possible, but they also grieved for the decades of uncertainty they had endured and the justice that would never be served. Nancy's niece spoke for the family. "We always believed this day would come. Nancy deserved to have her story told completely, and now it can be. We can finally say her name without wondering who took her from us." Detective Chen stood before a packed room of reporters and community members, prepared to announce the resolution of Sacramento's most notorious cold case. Media interest had been intense since word leaked that Nancy's murder had been solved, and the press conference represented the official conclusion of a 5-decade investigation. After 52 years, we can finally provide answers to Nancy Bennallack's family and to our community, Chan began. Through advanced DNA analysis and forensic genealogy, we have identified Richard John Davis as the person responsible for Nancy's murder on October 25, 1970. The announcement generated immediate questions from reporters seeking details about the investigation and the methods used to identify Davis. Chen explained the role of genetic genealogy while emphasizing the importance of preserving evidence and never giving up on cold cases, even when solutions seem impossible. The press conference was broadcast live on local television and streamed online, reaching an audience far beyond Sacramento. Nancy's story became a symbol of persistence and scientific advancement, demonstrating how modern techniques could deliver justice that had been delayed for decades. Community reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with residents expressing satisfaction that Nancy's case had finally been resolved. The apartment complex where she had lived issued a statement honoring her memory and expressing support for her family. Former courthouse colleagues who remembered Nancy shared memories of a dedicated professional whose life had been tragically cut short. The announcement also served as a warning to other killers who believed time had protected them from discovery. Advances in forensic science meant that no case was truly cold, and evidence preserved from decades earlier could suddenly become relevant again. Sacramento residents absorbed the news of Nancy's solved murder with a mixture of satisfaction and reflection. Many remembered the fear that had gripped the community in 1970 when a brutal killer had seemed to vanish without a trace. The revelation that Davis had lived quietly among them for decades was both shocking and oddly reassuring. The monster had been ordinary, not the supernatural threat that popular imagination had created. Former residents of Nancy's apartment complex expressed amazement that they had unknowingly lived near a killer. Some recalled Davis as a quiet neighbor who kept to himself, while others had no memory of him at all. The banality of evil was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the revelation. Violence could emerge from the most unremarkable sources. The case became a national symbol of cold case investigation, featured in television documentaries and true crime podcasts that examined the role of forensic genealogy in solving historical murders. Nancy's story inspired other families to advocate for their own cold cases, hoping that science might provide answers that had eluded traditional investigation. Legal experts discussed the implications of solving crimes decades after they occurred, when prosecution was impossible due to the suspect's death. These cases provided closure for families and communities while highlighting the limitations of delayed justice. The satisfaction of knowing the truth competed with frustration that accountability would never be achieved. Nancy's case demonstrated how patient preservation of evidence and continuous technological advancement could eventually solve even the most challenging investigations. The lesson for law enforcement was clear: never give up, never discard evidence, and never assume that time has defeated justice permanently. On a clear October morning in 2022, exactly 52 years after Nancy's murder, family members and community supporters gathered at her gravesite for a memorial service that was both celebration and closure. The headstone that had long borne only her name and dates now represented a complete story rather than an enduring mystery. Detective Chen spoke about Nancy's case as an example of persistence and hope, acknowledging the investigators who had worked on the case over 5 decades and the family members who had never stopped seeking justice. The investigation had required the efforts of multiple generations, each building on the work of predecessors and adding their own contributions to the eventual solution. Nancy's story had evolved from tragedy to inspiration, demonstrating that truth could emerge even after decades of silence. Her case encouraged other cold case investigations and provided hope to families who continued waiting for answers about their own murdered loved ones. The memorial service concluded with a reading of Nancy's name and a brief description of her life, not as a victim, but as a young woman who had contributed to her community and been loved by family and friends. Her professional accomplishments, her engagement, and her future plans were remembered alongside acknowledgement of the violence that had ended her life. As attendees departed, Nancy's gravesite returned to quiet dignity. Her story was complete now, her killer identified and her memory preserved. Justice had come late, but it had come, proving that some truths are too important to remain buried forever. The investigation that began with a young woman's murder in 1970 had ended with scientific triumph and family closure in 2022, spanning generations and demonstrating humanity's commitment to truth and accountability.